Welcome to On Our Way, a podcast about grief and loss. Beryl Botman is my name. Good day. Marketing the books that I've written took me on my way to meet my readers, some of whom posed yet another challenge. The readers found the themes raised in my book, Without You and Still Love Remains, valuable enough to encourage me to speak to a different audience. The podcast On Our Way became yet another steep learning curve, very challenging, but very rewarding. And here we are, close on 1 year later. I approach podcasts very similar to the way I approach my writing. I recognize that it is a different medium and the planning thereof has to fit the medium. But I find, as with my writing, one of the most important aspects is planning. Planning involves many different phases. In the first instance, I'm not as comfortable with podcasting as I am with writing. My whole life and career incorporated writing. So I had to do some research. I did internet research in terms of what is a podcast. I had to read different articles and I found that there's a whole world of difference in podcasts. So the internet introduced different approaches and different types. And what I had to do was to look at what I found and decide which of those I feel comfortable with. So I had choices to be made, decisions to be taken. I had to determine what is the purpose, what is it that I want to achieve. I have to have a clear point of view. When I'm speaking to people, I speak my point of view. And it must be clear that it is my point of view and people can respond to it with their point of view. I didn't quite know how to approach it. I didn't have a clear idea of who my audience would be. In fact, I wondered who is going to listen to my podcast, because a podcast to me is a much huger medium than writing a book and putting it into print and taking it to the market. I have much more control. Putting myself out on the broader social media platforms was quite intimidating initially, and I didn't know that people would actually be interested. But I acted upon the advice of my readers, who was my audience for my writing, and I did that. I spoke with my audience, my readers in mind, those people who asked me to write. So I projected my podcast and the topics to them. I have to also make decisions about the regularity of the podcast, the intervals at which they will be released, and some thoughts and decisions about the structure of the episodes, how structured. I started out being quite structured, and I found as I progressed from the one episode to the others, it became more fluid. And the structure extended over time. It didn't necessarily take the same structure each one of the episodes. So after taking all those decisions, I had to make sure that I have enough content to sustain a long conversation. The themes are from my books. I identified and I made a list of them. And so that exercise took me back to my books in a new way, in a more reflective way. As I browsed them, I looked at the themes and the topics in a certain way, looking back. How do I feel now about what I've written then? How do I think differently or maybe the same about those themes? Then I had to decide on a title and a subtitle, and my decision was On Her Way and the subtitle. A podcast about grief and loss. The title and the subtitle is to reflect the spirit and the content of the podcast. Initially, I incorporated some readers' comments and responses as they were released, but I have changed the structure as I go along. So, as I said, I've started out with specific sequencing and changed it as I went along, as I felt what was necessary and what was not. But I mentioned the reader's response and comments. I find it a valuable way of navigating myself, and it actually is a good indicator also of what people take from what I have to say. And so I realized that it was not only my thoughts and my feelings about what I've written in my books, but that I had to revise, reorganize, and restructure not only my themes and my initial planning, but I could also do it as a process and develop organically. The question about the podcast is, how is it different from my books? I have to make a point of it that I'm not just regurgitating what I've written in my books in this new medium. I was from the start aware that I couldn't be speaking solely on what I've written 5 years before, because I've written those books 5 years after 5 years of my mourning process, 5 years after Russell passed away. And I started with the podcast 10 years after he passed away, so 5 years after I started writing. And so, of course, I was at a different place and I had to reflect on it differently. I had to rethink my perspective and restate my perspectives where they stayed the same. I could speak about the issues in my books in hindsight, and I could reconsider thinking them. And I could also bring in new experiences into my podcast that I didn't necessarily engage with during those 5 years of mourning and during my writing process. I can take my present situation into account and reflect on my books from a new perspective. 5 years after writing the books, 10 years after Russell's passing. What did doing the podcast demand from me? I have already mentioned planning. I'm a firm believer in planning, that I have to know what is it that I'm going to speak about. I have to think about that. I have to do my preparation. I had to prepare and plan the podcast series as a whole, thinking of all the episodes and how long will I plan it for. How many topics do I want to cover? And as an aside, the list of topics also changed as I went along, and the sequence in which I presented them also didn't stay static. But it's important for me to do the preparation and planning for the podcast as a whole. From beginning to end, I must know what I'm going to say. Finding new materials, reading about the different topics or themes that I'm speaking, and learning from them in order to provide a fresh perspective on my books. So all of this takes dedication. You have to stick to your plan. You have to be disciplined and be ready to produce. Be ready to do the recording, both for the promotion video as well as the podcast itself. So each episode is to have content, and you must have title and prepare a blurb, a summary of what you can expect in the podcast. And I had to be prepared for the video recordings. I had to prepare my appearance. What do I want to look like? I have to be on time. I have to be available to the producer. Speaking about producer, I would strongly recommend finding an efficient and knowledgeable producer, as I have found in Catherine Pretorius, my daughter. I found that my generation, there is too much for us to learn about. For me, at least, to learn about doing this podcast. The one thing is the technical side of it, with good equipment and the microphones, as well as lighting and the videographing and the sound that needs to be done. That I might have been able to handle with some guidance of what kind of technical things I have to do if I wanted to on my own. But the thing that would have challenged me tremendously is to get it out there, to go and post it on Facebook. I might have managed, but YouTube and Apple, Spotify, that would have been a major challenge for me. So Catherine took charge of all of that. She also kept me on my toes and reminded me of what the next thing is. She designed a banner for the podcast. She ensures that every video and every audio recording is of high quality. Editing would have been a challenge for me. She takes very good care of that. I am satisfied the way I come across and the way I look. I come across all sleek and polished because of her. And the publishing, the posting, the loading, and social media platforms, she takes care of all of that. And so I encourage you, if you have something to say and you think it is important, a podcast is a wonderful way in which to communicate. I have to confess, I am amazed at how many people listen to what I have to say. I am surprised. I am even more surprised to learn that people even in Mexico or Canada and Australia are interested in what I have to say. So this is amazing. It's an amazing medium to communicate if there's something that is important enough for you to communicate. For me, there is no money to be made, only a message to be conveyed. I appreciate my listeners. I appreciate the feedback, especially the younger women finding what I have to say of some value. I'm grateful to my readers for opening my head to different audiences and different mediums. Thanks for encouraging me and inspiring me to deliver every time, on time. You have been listening to another new avenue on my podcast, On Our Way, with Beryl Botman. Walk tall, tell it all. You've been listening to On Our Way with Beryl Botman. You can purchase my books online on Amazon, Takealot, and at bookstores like Exclusive Books, Bargain Books, independent bookstores, and Barnes & Noble internationally. To connect with me, please follow me on Facebook to learn more about my book launches and talks. You can write to me at beryl.botman60@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.